Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week, we're turning our eyes to Venezuela's troubled presidential election. As we record this, the country is tipping into widespread political unrest. Venezuelans across the country have taken to the streets to challenge the results of the election, which has been claimed by incumbent President Nicolas Maduro. Maduro has asked state security forces to suppress these demonstrations. Now, Venezuela is no stranger to unrest. In 2014, 2017, 2019, widespread protests against the Maduro government were crushed by security forces. Meanwhile, the country has become a byword for economic mismanagement. Under the government headed by Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, they have overseen a man-made humanitarian disaster that has seen 7.7 million Venezuelans flee the country. That is a quarter of the population because of food shortages and skyrocketing inflation. That has led to a flood of people to neighboring countries and indeed the US. So the question now is whether the security forces will again side with Nicolas Maduro or whether there are any international players from those nearby, Brazil, Colombia, or further away, the EU, who might have the influence in Caracas to bring about a change of direction. I have a terrific panel here to discuss this crisis and the path ahead. Joining me down the line from Caracas is Paola Bautista de Aleman, a journalist turned opposition politician. Welcome.
Thanks for having me and for opening space to talk about my country.
Paola, great to have you with us. And also with us from Caracas is Michael Stott. He was just saying the sun is not yet up on this country in crisis. He is the Latin America editor of the Financial Times. Welcome.
Thank you, Bronwen, for the invitation.
Great to have you as well. And finally, a returning voice to this podcast, Chris Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America in our US and Americas program. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Paola, I wonder if you could start by telling us, just as we're speaking now, what the situation is.
Right now, the situation in the country is really tense since Nicolás Maduro didn't recognize the results of the election and they had an open fraud. We have mobilizations all around the country. Security forces of the state are trying to stop the mobilizations with repression. According to Foro Penal, which is a human rights NGO, since Monday, we have had 132 arrested and 11 killed. Even though this is hard and is a state of violence in the country, I must say the Venezuelan people are willing to make his voice heard. And this time is different since the protests that we had in 2014 or 2017 or 2019. And I see three reasons. First, the mobilizations are spontaneous and are mostly on sectors that used to be Chavistas. Second, the people are not afraid anymore. Maybe you saw the images of people turning down Chavez statues. Well, that was unthinkable a few years ago. And third, we have the votes, and we know that we won the election.
Paola, I described you as a journalist turned into an opposition politician. Can you tell us a bit about your role?
Well, I am part of the national board of Primera Justicia, which is a political party that is member of the Unitary Platform, that is the opposition coalition in the country. And I also work at the national commando of the presidency of Edmundo González Urrutia and María Corina Machado.
And what is it that you and your colleagues are trying to do right now in response to the election?
Well, we are trying to make the people's voice heard, to make the vote the reality of political change that we are fighting for. It's amazing how Edmundo González Urrutia actually won the election with 70% of the votes, and how the CNE, that is the electoral board in the country, just said that it was the other way around. So right now, with the support of the international community and of the people of Venezuela, we are trying to make the votes count and open doors to democracy in our country.
Michael, could you just tell us what the nature of the formal challenges to this vote is? Because there have been a lot of formal protests, haven't there? And the opposition saying we have completely different tallies to the extent that we can establish them.
That's right, Bronwen, yes. So The voting itself proceeded largely according to plan. There was a very high turnout. People were able to reach polling stations and vote using the electronic voting machines and express their will. The problem started after polling closed. So, what's supposed to happen there is that the electronic machines produce a tally, and then there is a paper trail, a paper audit trail, which can be checked as well from boxes and confirmed. And each party has witnesses at the polling stations which can verify what's happening, and they're supposed to sign the official record of that polling station's results. And it's then meant to be transmitted to the electoral authority. So there's a very clear process. The process broke down quite quickly in the hours after polls closed. And what happened was, according to the witnesses, they were shooed away from polling stations, not given the tallies in many cases that they were entitled to by law. In some cases, soldiers appeared at polling stations and took away the boxes of paper trails and records, and the results stopped being transmitted to the Electoral Council. So there was this sort of chaos in the count. There was a complete silence from the electoral authority for 6 hours after polls closed. And again, because of the electronic voting system, they should be able to come out with results quite quickly. But for 6 hours, there was silence. And then suddenly this single announcement after midnight, early on Monday morning, that Maduro had won by 51% of the votes, and that this was with 80% counted, and there'd been a foreign hacking attack. So this was met with complete derision, I think it's fair to say, by really anybody who had witnessed what was going on at the time. The exit polls, the quick counts, the mood in the country, everything pointed to an overwhelming opposition victory. And this result was simply not credible in any shape or form.
So what is the force of that derision? What happens now about that challenge?
This is the problem. So people have been coming out on the streets to protest, but that's a dangerous thing to do in Venezuela. And Maduro has moved very quickly to try to create facts on the ground. So within hours of the electoral authority proclaiming him the victor, he had organized a ceremony at the Electoral Council, received a certificate, official certificate of his victory, made a victory speech, hailing his triumph over counter-revolutionary and fascist forces, and launched a crackdown on the opposition. And that crackdown involved not just tear gas, but also the use of live ammunition against protesters who were trying to approach the presidential palace. So there was a very clear message from the government that if you challenge this result, you face arrest or you face serious injury or even death on the streets. And so that's the sort of stalemate we're in at the moment.
So, Chris, perhaps you can take us into the significance of all this, why this matters, obviously for Venezuela and its people, but also for the region and even wider than that.
So let's start with the region, Bronwen. As you mentioned in the introduction, more than 7.7 million Venezuelans have left. About 3 million of them are in Colombia. Close to 1 million of them are in Brazil. And about 1 million, close to 1 million, are in the United States. Now, let's take this first from the United States. In an electoral season in the United States where immigration is the hot issue, this has become a calling card, if you will, for xenophobic elements within the United States. Ironically, it was actually the Trump policies of maximum pressure that, in part, the sanctions did sort of augment that immigration, but now they're using it as an example of both Biden and Kamala Harris's failed immigration policies. But if you look at polls before the election, more than a third of the Venezuelans still living in Venezuela said they will leave the country if Maduro is reelected. And so you're looking at just even a more massive exodus. And while Colombia and Brazil have done a great job of welcoming Venezuelan refugees effectively, providing them with services in some cases, in Brazil giving them residency cards, trying to reintegrate them into society. We're already beginning to see some frictions of a backlash in those countries. But of course, another third of the country that would spill over would certainly trigger negative reactions in those countries. So, for the first time really in a regional crisis of this magnitude, what started out as a domestic crisis, now you have Colombia and Brazil with real stake in this matter. But if you look beyond the region, Venezuela has for a long time allied itself with, if you will, sort of the axis of the malign. And indeed, China and Russia sent election observers, not two countries not known for their free and fair elections, while the Venezuelan government disinvited the European Union from monitoring the elections. And immediately after Maduro's announcement of his reelection, as Michael described, China congratulated Maduro, Russia congratulated Maduro, as did Nicaragua, Cuba, Syria, Iran. Clearly, what we're seeing is not just a willingness to embrace a clearly rogue regime, but also willingness to try to support it. And so whatever the reaction may be from the European Union, from Brazil and neighbors, it's clear that Russia and China has plenty of resources, are willing to try to back this regime and try to challenge the international consensus over elections, democracy, and human rights.
So, Michael, do you think this pressure, for example, from the EU, the criticism from Brazil and so on, does that make any difference at all?
I have to say, Bronwen, that the international reaction so far has been deeply disappointing, given that there was always a strong possibility that Maduro would try to steal this election. It was something the opposition was very clear about all through the campaign. So it's something the international community should have been prepared for, and yet they appeared flat-footed and almost caught out by the announcement. And what we've seen has been an insistence from the US, Brazil, and the EU that the full station-by-station tally of results should be released. But we've almost moved well beyond this point now. Maduro has created facts on the ground. He's effectively granted himself a victory and cracked down. And yet the international community is still stuck asking for detailed tallies of results. So I think there needs to be a recognition on the part of the international community that they have to move beyond that and start thinking about, A, first clearly saying that this election was not acceptable, they will not recognize it, and B, taking some measures in response to it. But as long as they keep stuck on this insistence on asking for tallies, I don't think we're going to get anywhere.
And what kind of measures are you thinking of?
I think the only measures that Maduro really cares about are, A, that his victory is not recognized fully, that would hurt him, and B, that the economic ones against him and his inner circle in particular. So there are some sanctions against some of the inner circle from Maduro, from the EU and the UK, but there are plenty more people, including those responsible for repression in the army and the security forces, that could be added to that list. And I think it's important that the international community starts acting on that now.
Paola, what do you make of this pressure by international countries, the EU among them, saying we don't accept the result of this? What is the opposition calling on them to do at this point?
You know, the problem, Bronwen, here is that we have done everything. We have done the elections before. We have won the election. The international community have not recognized the results before this crisis. I think that the real problem here is that democracy and the Western civilization, they don't have a strong answer when autocracies work together and try to stay in power. I think that Venezuela is an example that how autocracies work together and how democracy cannot do it on the right way. And I think that that's the real problem here.
What do you think about the threat of sanctions that Michael was just talking about, sanctions against individuals? And we spend a lot of time talking about whether or not those have really had any effect on Russia.
Yes, I know that sanctions is a controversial topic here in the country. And we know that sanctions have collateral damages on the population, but it's the only tool that democracies on the world have to make pressure on the government, on the dictatorship. There is no another tool when you have a dictator that says that he's going to be in power no matter what. So I think that the next step for the international community are going to be sanctions.
Chris, you were talking about how Russia and China, for a start, supported Venezuela. What's the nature of that support beyond the words that say, we welcome the result of this obviously free and fair election?
Russia has provided assistance to Venezuela, but it's mostly in the form of diplomatic recognition. Russia and Venezuela have worked together, in Venezuela helping Russia evade its sanctions. Russia's also previously had helped bail out the state gas companies and manage the debt. They supposedly own a fair amount of the bonds of Venezuelans' debt, which is about $150 billion right now. China has more cash to offer and more support to provide. China does buy, often illegally, under the sanctions, Venezuelan oil. It also does provide assistance. In fact, Venezuela is one of the highest recipients of Chinese largesse, if you will, loans and investment in Latin America, and it will continue to do so. By the same token, too, China, also provides, as does Russia, also provides intelligence assistance, as does Cuba. One of the Cuban advisors, intelligence advisors, are deeply embedded in the Venezuelan security forces and alert the government to any form of dissent within those armed forces. So they each provide something, but it's not going to be enough to rebuild an economy that's clearly deeply shaken, but one that has contracted by 75% since effectively 2013. I think the real question here will be, what will be the reaction of the few investors that have responded to the opening up of sanctions? That includes a number of European companies, oil and gas companies, and a U.S. company. Will they put pressure on the government to do something? I think that's one of the few avenues, and I would hope the threat of sanctions may make them wake up a little bit and take a more moral and, if you will, even profit-driven stance.
These are huge numbers we're talking about, the economy contracting by 3/4. Paola, what is the effect of that on the ground? What is the real effect for people's lives of the economy collapsing in the way that it has done?
Well, 6 out of 10 Venezuelans live under the levels of critical poverty in the country. And we have a lot of inequality. We have also a lack of work for the people. And that's the engine and the things that makes people thinking that if there is no a change, they will have to leave the country. And that it's going to be a tsunami, a migration tsunami in the region, that Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and all the countries in Latin America are going to be affected by that. So if the countries around in our neighborhood in Latin America and in Europe or the United States, if they don't have a tool to pressure Nicolas Maduro to make the votes value of to the political change, we're going to have a strong and huge crisis in the region.
What does that actually look like in Caracas and outside in the rural areas? Lots of people living in poverty, and a quarter of people haven't left. What do you notice? What do you see when you go around the streets?
Well, when you go to rural places, not Caracas. No, Caracas is different. It's a lot of inequality. You can have, I mean, beautiful restaurants and cars and people with a lot of money. But once you go away from Caracas to the rural sectors, you can see people who, I mean, they don't have work. The children, they don't go to school. We don't have hospitals. And they are like dead towns. I mean, people who are doing nothing. And these are the people who are now protesting for the political change because they are aware that they don't have future in the country if Nicolas Maduro stays in power.
So, Michael, what does this mean for the economy? And I follow your reports in the FT very closely on this. It is a dire situation, isn't it? On the one hand, huge reserves of oil. On the other hand, this economy, which is, as Chris was beginning to describe, has every element that might frighten off investors.
Yes, so there's an interesting picture on the economy. I mean, there was this tremendous collapse that Chris referred to, and then the last few years, last sort of 3 years, there's been a very slight, modest recovery, which has benefited a few, it's fair to say, really the sort of better off in Caracas, who are living now better than they did a few years ago. And that's largely thanks to what Maduro has adopted in terms of economic policy, which has been a rather sort of savage capitalism, ironically, given his revolutionary socialist credentials. So he opened up the economy to imports, scrapped price controls, allowed the use of the dollar, and that gave the private sector here a bit of relief. And then, of course, last year, the US lifted most sanctions for a time to encourage the electoral process, and that provided more money and let some more oil money flow into the economy. It's not benefited the people at all. I mean, the people, as Paola mentioned, are still living miserably. They haven't felt any benefit. But there has been a benefit for the elites in Caracas, ironically. And that's, of course, I think where the international community needs to act and say, no, that little bit of air, little bit of oxygen we gave to the economy over the last year to encourage elections, well, if you're going to cheat and steal the elections, we're going to take that oxygen away again. I think it's the only logical, fair, and moral response to what the government is doing.
Just to give a sense of how far Venezuela has sunk, there was a time when Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America. Now, as an oil-producing country, obviously there was a great amount of inequality, and later came corruption. But it is, this is the worst economy in history that has not been under a war.
That is an amazing figure in itself. Let's just go on to what then that means for China trying to recruit, or indeed successfully recruiting Venezuela as one of its allies or part of an axis, whatever term you want, and for the China's zone of influence that it has been building up. Is Venezuela valuable in that, Chris?
It is only because it gives it some leverage within the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere, it's an offensive term, but it's often looked upon as being the United States' backyard. It's been sort of more solidly even, with the EU. And this is really a direct challenge, both the United States and sort of the Western concept of Latin America. So it's very powerful there. Russia, by the way, sent 2 warships to Venezuela about a month ago, demonstrating again that it can still patrol the seas and even in the U.S.'s hemisphere. So, in these cases, it's really about stacking up allies on your column relative to the United States. And while Venezuela, certainly in the short term, is never going to be any economic powerhouse or diplomatic powerhouse, China is demonstrating that even when the world is focused on it, and the EU and the UK and other countries have pressured for elections, they're willing to stand by a government that completely just thumbs its nose at any international norms regarding human rights, regarding investment, regarding elections. And that sort of proves their case.
Michael, do you agree with that? Is this a valuable symbolic card for China, or does it have even more value beyond that?
I think it's a useful bridgehead for them in a continent which is rich in natural resources. As Chris says, there's a lot of nuisance value in having one of the larger and more important Latin American countries in your column on your side. And Venezuela has the potential to cause disruption across Latin America. The refugee crisis is one example, but there are more sinister things. There's the Tren de Aragua, one of the largest, nastiest, and most vicious drug cartels in Latin America, which has spread out from Venezuela and caused havoc as far away as Chile. And there was a case recently where a Venezuelan who'd defected was tracked down and killed by Venezuelan intelligence forces, allegedly, in Chile. So Venezuela has this potential to cause trouble on a much larger scale across the continent and to foment political unrest, to help agitation. And so it's quite useful in that respect for the Russians and the Chinese to use. As Chris says, though, it's clearly weak economically, and there's certainly some annoyance that I've heard about from the Chinese that they don't get paid very well by Venezuela. Venezuela still owes them quite a lot of money and is quite a poor payer. So that's certainly a source of irritation, but that's more than outweighed by the sort of political and diplomatic value of a country that can help to export unrest and revolution.
Very neatly put. And what about the migration factor in destabilizing other countries? These are huge numbers again.
They're very big numbers, and it's been a huge problem for Colombia in particular. As Chris said, they were the biggest recipients, but it's also a problem for the United States as it approaches a presidential election. A lot of these Venezuelans went up through the Darien Gap, through the jungle in Panama, across Central America, through Mexico, and found their way to the US border, got across, and then have in some cases reached New York in very big numbers and caused a sort of mini crisis in the city last year, you might remember. So it's become a factor in the US presidential election as well, which makes, I think, the US's rather flat-footed response to the crisis even more surprising, because it's quite possible that if this crackdown succeeds, and God hope it doesn't, but if it succeeds, there could well be another big wave of Venezuelan migration, which would be reaching the US border pretty much about time for the election. So you'd think the Biden administration has every incentive to act now.
Remembering once what a leftist anti-US Haitian leader once said, he said, Haiti doesn't have nuclear weapons, but we have human trafficking and human cargo that we could unleash on the U.S. and disrupt its politics. And I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's very possible. If you're Russia and you're China and you want to mess with the United States elections, you want to throw some fire on social unrest in Latin America, you want to see, it's a sad human cost, but you want to see waves of immigrants fleeing Venezuela and disrupting politics across the Western Hemisphere.
That is an extraordinary, dispiriting way for any leader to talk about their own population. We talk about it a lot, where say Iran and Russia destabilizing the Sudan and not unhappy at the not the grief, but the migration that results from that. But to talk about your own population, about that as a weapon, is really quite something. Paola, perhaps you can just bring us back to life as it is now, because these are huge numbers that we've been talking about, particularly the number of people who have moved so quickly. What are people feeling about the future? The Venezuelans who've left will come back? What is the expectation of the future of this country?
You know, the Maria Corina's campaign, political campaign, was really moving and it was really emotional. The promise of the campaign was to bring people back in the country. And it was a beautiful campaign. And we had a lot of hope and expectation. And it's like we became the owners of our destiny. And these days, we can feel a little bit of frustration, even though we are trying to be strong in our faith and trying to make the votes count. You can feel in the country that the country is willing to fight to be in the streets, but there is also a lot of fear because Nicolás Maduro, well, yesterday he had a really, really strong and tough speech saying that he was going to be especially tough with the people who says that it was a fraud or the people who goes in the streets. So I think it's we're having hard times. And the most difficult thing is when you see that the country will start to lose hope and become frustrated. And that's when the people are going to take the decision if they're going to stay in the country or if they're going to leave. And I think that that's the most difficult part. And the countries in Latin America are really worried about that.
I can absolutely see that. And we talk separately in the Ukraine context about what that country, which has lost about 8 million people, a lot of those women and children are young people, whether it will get them back. And as you said, people need a sense that they can be agents of their life if they're going to stay. So we're going to have to stop there. A huge thank you to my guests, Paola Bautista de Aleman, Michael Stott, and Chris Sabatini. Do follow them all on X. Their details will be in the show notes. That concludes our second season of Independent Thinking. We're taking a short break just over August before we return in September, where we will be discussing the threats to democracy with journalist Anne Applebaum. Over August, there will still be a lot of commentary from Chatham House as the US presidential election continues to heat up. There's the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and there will be more developments in Venezuela. Chris Sabatini has a piece out this week on where the crisis in Venezuela may go next. And do head over to chathamhouse.org to follow the work of our US and Americas team and all our other teams. You can find all the episodes of Independent Thinking on all major platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, subscribe, and share. Well, ahead of that short break, a huge thank you to you, our listeners, from me and from the team behind Independent Thinking, and see you in September.